the arrogant mistreatment of the small countries. So the Icelandic offer, $6 billion, but with a limit according to this Keynesian notion of ability to pay, what Keynes had advanced vis-a-vis the German reparations back in the 1920s, right, that you have to limit the payments to what you can pay. Well, the problem with all these things with the ability to pay is, what if the debt is totally illegitimate, totally dictated, totally extortion and blackmail from the very beginning? Should you offer to pay anything? And I would say no. The limit that the Icelanders have offered is 6% of future GDP growth for debt service. That is what they offer. Now, unfortunately, there's confusion about this. We have the distinguished Professor Michael Hudson, economic advisor to Congressman Kucinich, writing in the London Financial Times of August 17, 2009. He says, this Icelandic offer is, as far as I'm aware, I'm quoting, quote, so far as I'm aware, the first since the 1920s to subordinate foreign debt to the country's ability to pay. Iceland's payments will be limited to 6% of growth in gross domestic product as of 2008. If creditors take action that stifle the Icelandic economy with austerity, and if immigration continues at the current rates to escape from this debt-ridden economy, there will be no growth, and the British and the Dutch, I supply, will not get their money. Unfortunately, this is not true. Alas, alas, alas. This has been tried before, and in actually a more realistic way than what the Icelanders are proposing. This is, of course, the regime of Alan Garcia Perez in Peru from 1985 to 1990, but especially in 85 and 86. I'm quoting now John Crabtree of Oxford Analytica, writing in his book on the subject. With Alan Garcia, for the first time, a heavily indebted country was unilaterally limiting debt payments to its own perceived capacity to pay. With the case of Alan Garcia in Peru, 1985, in his inaugural address, July 28, 1985, he said, you creditors of my country, you IMF, you World Bank, you Inter-American Development Bank, you Citibank, you American commercial banks and others, I offer you 10% of my export earnings, the dollars that I earn in trade. Now, 10% sounds less radical than 6%, but what Garcia was offering is 10% of the dollars that he was taking in, export earnings. Now, that is more germane. It's closer to the question at hand. You can imagine a country that has all kinds of GDP growth, and it might have virtually no balance of payments surplus, no export earnings, or it might even be running a deficit. That's possible too. So therefore, it's much more important to say the dollars you're taking in. But despite the fact that Alan Garcia's 10% solution of 1985 was in some ways more realistic and more carefully targeted than the Icelandic offer to the Anglo-Dutch, this was a failure. And the problems for this, of course, are just legion. Once you're paying, you can easily pay more. If you simply embargo all payments, it's easier to enforce that. Once you say the debt may be legitimate, but my ability to pay is somehow in question, then you've given up your moral, legal, and your juridical and political position. You're basically saying, well, we're having difficulty paying, poor us, but the idea that we should pay, of course, is correct. The idea seems to be, in the case of Alan Garcia, perhaps also in Iceland today, that by making an offer of a percentage of foreign exchange earnings in the case of Peru, or a percentage of future GDP growth in the case of Iceland, you're being more reasonable. You're not being extremely radical. You're not being that provocative. The problem is when you're dealing with bankers, both are communism. They don't care. Percentage growth, communism. Percentage of export earnings, equally communism, the end of the world. So this is what happened to Alan Garcia. He thought that his moderation would earn him some leeway, some wiggle room with the international banking community, but it did not. They treated Peru as if it were in full default. In October 1985, the U.S. Declared that Peruvian debt owed to U.S. banks was declared value impaired, and this meant that those banks had to set aside larger loan loss provisions. A bankers' steering committee chaired by Citibank was then set up to persecute Peru. In April 1986, the International Monetary Fund, which wanted to impose a program of monetarist neoliberal shock therapy on Peru, demanded an immediate payment of $70 million in debt arrears. When Peru did not comply, the IMF blacklisted Peru as ineligible for new loans, which meant that Peru was essentially a pariah state, along with Vietnam, Zambia, Somalia, Guyana, Sudan, and Liberia. Peru was cut off by the World Bank, cut off by the Inter-American Development Bank. The other problem is, at that time, there were other countries that wanted to declare the full Monty, the full debt moratorium, and it meant that there was friction between the debt moratorium countries and Peru with the 10% solution. So it's a half measure. And if you try to conduct your self-defense based on half measures, you can see this in innumerable historical examples. This is an uncertain trumpet. This will fail. Garcia realized about 2 years into his presidency that he should have done something to nationalize the banking system of his country so as to generate credit for production and for national economic purposes. But by that time, he then tried to seize some commercial banks. It was too late. He had lost his political mandate, and Peru then sank into the worst economic depression the country had in the 20th century, including not just a decline in domestic economic activity of 10 to 20%, but also hyperinflation of at least 4,500% per year. And the interesting thing is, at the beginning of the crisis, everybody in Peru would have said the IMF is the cause of our problems. After 2 or 4 years of Alan Garcia, a lot of people would say, well, the IMF is bad, but Alan Garcia is also making things worse. So it meant that the necessary unity and cohesion of the Peruvian people fighting these bankers had been lost in the process. So the idea is debt moratorium and a percentage solution sound like they're similar, but in reality they're antithetical. They're incompatible. They are two different worlds. As soon as you say we're going to fulfill the demands of the Anglo-Dutch, you find yourself very rapidly in the position of the German politicians of the 1920s, people like Gustav Stresemann, who said, we will try to fulfill the demands of the Allies. You then become the agency of them inside your own population, and you have tremendous political conflict, typical of Weimar Germany. We'll have more about this Icelandic case and the Peruvian parallel from 1985 next time. See you then on World Crisis Radio.
It's no secret that Genesis Communications Network depends on listeners like you. Now you can do even more to hear Genesis shows in your area. Simply call your local radio stations and tell them about your favorite GCN programs. It's easy. Log on to gcnlive.com or call us toll-free 877-807-4048. Make a difference. Call your local stations and contact us through affiliate relations at gcnlive.com or call 877-807-4048. Call today.
Hi, this is Ted Anderson. Have you ever wondered why banks, stockbrokers, investment advisors won't talk about gold IRAs? They've been available since 1986, yet the financial industry won't recognize the value of gold for your retirement. Gold has outperformed paper investments, yet no word about IRAs. If you would like to have gold for your retirement, call 800-686-2237. Don't get left behind by rising inflation and low returns. Call 800-686-2237. Secure your future and call 1-800-686-2237.